I have so many thoughts about this book, and I cannot wait to dive in. And in honor of this book, I am wearing my Young Lord sweatshirt. Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather, and on this channel I talk about books, social justice, and history. Today we're doing a little bit of all three of those things, books, social justice, and history, because we are going to be talking about Olga Dies Dreaming by Xochitl Gonzalez. Xochitl Gonzalez is a Puerto Rican Mexican author, so this book is Own Voices because the author also lives in Brooklyn. She's from Brooklyn, mostly takes place in Brooklyn. The author calls this book a love letter to Brooklyn, which I wholeheartedly agree, that is what it is. And for this video, I just kind of want to go into the politics of it because I really loved that this book talked about Puerto Rican history and culture. There's a lot of stuff happening in this book. There is discussion of colonialism, of gentrification, of the AIDS epidemic, of drug use, motherhood, and so much more. This story is told from the point of view of three different characters, four if you count their mother. So we have Olga, Prieto, and Richard. And Olga is still the main protagonist. She's the perspective that we get the most of. But also, it wasn't necessarily like a linear plotline. It jumped around in time, especially with their mother's letters that were written and placed throughout the story. But it really just felt like you were dropping into their lives, the characters' lives, for like a brief couple of months. And then, the book was over. So it was very much like a snapshot. Our bold-faced names in their hometown of New York. Prieto is a popular congressman representing their gentrifying Latinx neighborhood in Brooklyn, while Olga is the Tony wedding planner for Manhattan's power brokers. Despite their alluring public lives, behind closed doors, things are far less rosy. Olga and Prieto's mother, Blanca, a young lord turned radical, abandoned her children to advance a militant political cause, leaving them to be raised by their grandmother. Now, with the winds of hurricane season, Blanca has come barreling back into their lives. Set against the backdrop of New York City in the months surrounding the most devastating hurricane in Puerto Rico's history, all while asking what it really means to weather a storm. So from the start, I was indifferent about this book. In the synopsis, it felt anti-independence, anti-Puerto Rican independence, that is. To me, it felt like Hurricane Maria might be used as a trivial plot point, but I wanted to read it to know for sure, and of course I wanted to support a Puerto Rican author. I gave it 3 stars, which is kind of how I feel if I didn't love something, but I also didn't hate it. I didn't feel too strongly one way or the other, but it was entertaining, at least. Some of it felt a little performative and like it's politics, and I wasn't really moved by any of the storylines. I didn't feel like a real connection to any of the characters, but what was most frustrating for me was the politics. I'll get all into that in a bit. First, I want to talk about some of the things that I loved about this book, and then I'll get into my other thoughts. Moving forward, there will be spoilers, so proceed as you wish. I have like so many notes on my computer for this. I saw a tweet and it was like, normalize reading a book and immediately forgetting what it is about, and that's me to a T. If I don't write down my thoughts after I read something, that's it. I don't remember it. It's gone. So number one thing that I loved about this book is the cover, because wow, it's so beautiful. I love all the colors so much. I love this like blood orange background. I love the green and pink, which I feel kind of represents Puerto Rico. Then we have the yellow and blue, the city skyline for Brooklyn, and then of course the red and blue stars for, it has to be the United States because Puerto Rico only has 1 star in the flag. But I love the baby blue because the baby blue is like the ocean blue is the original blue of the Puerto Rican flag. So you can see in like here, it's like this baby blue with the stars, and on the Puerto Rican flag, it's a dark blue to match the American flag, but if you were to have like the true Puerto Rican flag, it would be this blue right here. To me, it screams Caribbean, it screams Puerto Rico. I love the cover. The second thing I loved about this book, I'm still trying to like reconcile this. I really loved Xochitl's writing style a lot. I loved the actual craft of the writing. However, I disliked the story. And so it's like this weird like place to be. I love the writing, but wasn't super a fan of the story. However, I thought a lot of her writing was really beautiful. I thought she explained difficult things really clearly and in a way that was easy for people to understand, especially if they're not Puerto Rican or they don't know the history about Puerto Rico. I think there was a lot of complex topics that she broke down really easily and that were like super understandable. So I really appreciated that. I think her writing was excellent, and I would definitely read anything she puts out in the future. So the next thing I loved was Blanca's letters to her children. And Blanca is Olga and Prieto's mother, and she abandoned them when they were children to pursue revolutionary movements in South America. In these letters, she revealed a lot of, in my opinion, accurate information and just opinions that are very much a part of like that leftist revolutionary movement. I think she had really accurate critiques of whiteness and critiques about US imperialism in Puerto Rico. I also think that as her letters went on throughout the novel, you could see how manipulative she was with her children in order to achieve her end goal of independence for Puerto Rico. I watched a bunch of videos with the author on YouTube before even sitting down to like kind of write my points for this video. And in one of the conversations, the author states that she made Blanca the female version of Filiberto, who was a independence leader in Puerto Rico who was killed in 2005. And she wanted to explore what it would be like if he were a woman. And so that's how Blanca was born, which I think really helps us to understand her motivations and kind of, for me at least, gives me more of an understanding of her character. And the last thing that I loved about this book is the inclusion of Puerto Rican history and culture, because I know that Puerto Rican history and culture is not mainstream. Like, these are not topics that we talk about in depth. The fact that this book talks about colonialism and imperialism and gentrification in Puerto Rico is really important. I'm really glad it's happening on like a broader platform where so many people can read this book and learn more about Puerto Rico's history. There was an article that I read called The Liberation of Olga by Andrea Gonzalez Ramirez, and it was an interview with Xochitl Gonzalez where she said, "I wanted all that history in there because we don't get taught our history and we forget and we're learning together. The disconnect is a way of disempowering us." Which, wow. I really love this quote. I think that when we are educated about our histories, we see what the people before us have accomplished. We know that we are capable of doing the same, that we're capable for fighting for change and for better futures for ourselves, for our families, and for our communities. Again, I just think what's most exciting about this novel is that it brings Puerto Rico's history to the table, and people will have a better understanding of US colonialism in Puerto Rico. The next thing I want to talk about, this book just really made me think about Puerto Rican identity and what it means to be a Puerto Rican in the diaspora. Diasporican is what we're usually called. And there are just so many ways to be Puerto Rican. You could look at any of the characters in this book. Puerto Ricans aren't a monolith. We're diverse and we have so many different experiences. So in this book, I think there's a larger discussion to be had about diasporicans' connection to Puerto Rico. And in this novel, there's a really strong connection to Brooklyn. And Olga goes as far to say is like she doesn't want to live in Puerto Rico. She wants to live in America because Brooklyn is her home. And it just made me think about my connection to Puerto Rico, how differently I experience that than how Olga does. It always makes me feel like, am I not Puerto Rican enough, or am I like too much Puerto Rican? Like, I feel like I need to tone it down. And it's just like, what does that even mean? What does it mean to be too little or too much Puerto Rican, right? And I just feel like depending on where you're from in the diaspora, your relationship to that identity and how you perceive and experience your own identity is determined by where you live and what kind of community you grew up in. It just made me think a lot about my connection to Puerto Rico and how I experience my relationship with my identity differently than Olga does. And this could be in part because of like who in my family is from Puerto Rico. When they came to the United States, her identity is different, but it's not any less Puerto Rican, right? My experience is not any less Puerto Rican than someone else. And it just made me think of like, how does our relationship with our identity change if we still have relatives in Puerto Rico versus if we don't? Does the relationship change if we speak Spanish or if we don't? Or if we grew up speaking it or if we had to learn it later in life? Does that relationship change if it was our parents who moved to the United States, if it was our grandparents, if it was our great-grandparents, if it was, went back longer than that, further back than that? And how does the relationship change at all if we've ever visited Puerto Rico, if we've never been to Puerto Rico, if we've been once or twice, or we go regularly? Like, how does that affect our identity and how we see our identity? Just like gave me so much to think about. Just want to say, like, there's no wrong way to be Puerto Rican if you have ancestral ties to Puerto Rico. All experiences of Puerto Rican identity is valid and it's unique to the person. So this book just really made me think about identity, what it means to be Puerto Rican, and how all of us in the diaspora experience our heritage so differently, and all of it is so beautiful. Alrighty, so now let's do it. Let's do it. The part I'm most nervous to say out loud. I want to talk about performative decolonization and the pro-statehood stance in this novel. There was a review I read on Goodreads that called this book liberal clownery, which for me kind of hits the nail on the head. I said earlier I found this book to be a bit performative. I feel like this caters to a true neoliberal ideology, which it's possible that's what the author is going for. Maybe these are her own political views. I'm sure they are. It's her novel. So the first example is we have Olga, who goes viral for her ramblings on TV about Puerto Rico, about the president's inaction in response to the hurricane in Puerto Rico. So we have Olga, who's trying to donate $10,000 to Chef Andres, but she realizes that if she donates it electronically, he won't be able to access it because there's no electricity in Puerto Rico for him to take out the cash at an ATM. So she decides to try and convince her brother, who's a congressman, to take down a duffel bag full of cash. He's like, I'm a congressman, I can't do that, that's sketchy. So he doesn't. She thinks about purchasing a flight to go down and do aid work to help support people, and she doesn't do that either. She doesn't do anything. It just makes it seem like it was okay if you were just so struck with grief that you didn't do anything to help. Like, she had the opportunity to give $10,000 and she's like, never mind, too much work. And there were like so many ways to help Puerto Ricans in the aftermath of the hurricane. There were so many ways for her to have supported, and she didn't. Unless I'm like totally blanking and there's a part later on in the novel where she does give back, but I don't remember there being something aside from her mother, her partnership with her mother. Maybe I'm just forgetting. But for someone who talks so passionately about colonialism, she didn't do anything to offer tangible support to Puerto Ricans. Right? She had the means to provide support to people who were suffering directly from colonialism, which she obviously is against. Super strongly. That part of it felt very performative to me. So for me, the biggest ally to the Puerto Rican people outside of Puerto Rico is the Puerto Rican diaspora. I firmly believe this. I think that the diaspora, when they're capable, has a responsibility to support and be an ally to the Puerto Rican people in Puerto Rico. Also, from a plot standpoint, I think it would have been a really beautiful decision to have had Olga go down to Puerto Rico and do aid work. Right, like she talks about how it's like saviorism and she doesn't want to do that. But of all the people who should be going down to help Puerto Rico, I think it should have been Puerto Ricans who, had the means or had the time to do it. I feel like it would have been a really good way for her to connect with her heritage. Being in Puerto Rico after the hurricane and helping would have been so wonderful. I think I pro Olga being in Puerto Rico. That's my thoughts. And then next we have Prieto. And I know Prieto has this whole plotline, right, where he is closeted, he is being blackmailed to vote for specific things, to vote for certain projects in his hometown of Brooklyn. However, he is so aware of colonialism and exploitation of Puerto Rico because of how he grew up and with the parents that he grew up with. Him and Olga are raised by two young lords who are pro-Puerto Rican independence. He learns about colonialism from a young age, and yet I'm pretty sure he's pro-statehood, and he voted for Promesa without being blackmailed to vote for it. Like, that was something he did on his own free will. Promesa is continued colonialism, and Puerto Ricans were saying this before Promesa was even enacted, before it was voted on. Puerto Ricans were speaking out about Promesa and how bad it would be if it was enacted. And it just feels like a really good example of Americans. And I'm talking about Prieto in this case too, because he is also an American politician. He didn't listen to the Puerto Rican people. Like, he has the power to help them, and he just kind of ignores them and steps over them and is like, nope, I'm gonna make this decision for you, even though it's not what you want, which is just like more colonialism. Even if he realized he was wrong in his votes, he says he regrets voting for Promesa, and then also some of his votes he was blackmailed into them. I still find it hard because it's like you're still causing significant harm. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. That's really hard for me to get past.
Hi. So this whole section is kind of me, I think, trying to say that I really want Puerto Ricans especially to take a look at how we can be better allies to Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico and how we can uplift the voices of Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico, especially when Puerto Ricans in the United States have the privilege to be heard by their representatives and can advocate for policy that affects the lives of Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico.
So these things just felt really performative to me because when you have a book that talks about being anti-colonial and then we're doing these things that kind of do more colonialism or don't take action at all, it's just kind of like, why are we even talking about it if we're not going to do. If we're not gonna work towards something, I don't know, maybe that's a social worker in me. I want to work towards something. If there's a problem, a systemic issue, like let's dismantle it. Let's create better futures. So the next thing I want to talk about are the depictions of the independence movement. I think this is what I mentioned before, how the politics in the book upset me the most, and it was really the depiction of the independence movement. So here's what I want to start with. The independence movement was a target of COINTELPRO, which was an FBI project to surveil, infiltrate, and disrupt social organizations of the United States. And in a way, I think this book also dismissed the independence movement and framed it as like this delusional, fringe, cultish organization, which is exactly how the FBI has always portrayed it and the US media has always portrayed it. So I feel like it just does the independence movement a disservice. So let's take a look at some of the language from the book. So on page 128, we have Prieto's POV. He says, to follow a fringe figure in the independence movement that would never succeed was for Prieto a pernicious blow. Her file recast their abandonment as futile, her cause not only impossible, but the means insane. Then on page 222, Olga's talking to Reggie. She says, she's convinced you that somehow she amassed an underground revolutionary army gearing up for independence. The rational businessman in you has got to know how nuts this sounds. Page 310, somehow with this manic dream of hers, she figured out how to lure some of them, college students, up here. Now he seemed to be, at least in part, financing her commune, or was it a cult? And then on page 346, there's an instance of calling Blanca's friends brainwashed for having radical politics and being members of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, which kind of gives this impression that people who are fighting against racism, classism, sexism, etc. are brainwashed, which I hate that notion. I think all of these instances, these were just a couple that I could find from memory. It makes it seem like the independence movement is rooted in like these super violent extremist ideals made up of ideologies that are delusional and irrational, with like believers who are fanatics, who are brainwashed, or suffer from mental illness. And it just feels like it makes independence feel unattainable and ridiculous, like it's a far-off dream that can never be accomplished. Also, I think it ignores that the independence movement is pretty active. There are collectives and groups of activists that engage in community work. They've led some of the biggest actions in recent Puerto Rican history and Puerto Rico's history in general. More recently, they've led marches on abortion rights. They advocate for LGBTQIA rights. They advocate against gentrification. They advocate for environmental justice. They were some of the leaders for the Ricky Renuncia protests in the summer of 2019. I just felt like this book was portraying people who believe in independence as like these fringe, violent people, and it's like they're people who are in communities, who are actively engaging in community work to make their communities better places to live and to fight for enhanced justice across the nation. There was so much more to uplift than talk about like this one woman off in the mountains.
So with this part of the book, I still have some feelings about it. Even listening now, this is like weeks later since filming. I'm wondering if it was written this way to show that the independence movement overcame huge obstacles in order to even happen to have such a large-scale action for independence at the end. However, I just feel like it still just feels super disconnected from the community aspect of what I perceive independence to be, which is like love for community, love for people, love for country. I still feel like this huge disconnect between her work and her vision and this compound in the mountains from the actual community work and actions that are happening currently in Puerto Rico.
So relating to this, I want to talk about Blanca and her letters. So because of how the independence movement was portrayed, it made her seem like an unreliable narrator, and how the history sometimes feels exaggerated because of how unreliable she can sometimes seem. Right, so if we have an independent movement that is labeled delusional and brainwashed and, you know, all those things that we just talked about, when she's talking about the history, she's going to sound delusional, brainwashed, not in the right mind, not rational. I just don't think it does any good to the movement or to Puerto Rico's history to have kind of like that vibe. Maybe I'm the only one who thought that, but those were just some of my thoughts. All right, let's talk about the ending because feelings. Okay. The ending felt out of place for me. The revolution felt a little more magical than realistic because of how Blanca's portrayed and how she's portrayed as delusional, how the independence movement is also seen as delusional and fringe. It just felt like it was just the work of like this one lone woman in the mountains all by herself. There's nothing in the novel prior to this revolution that connects what Blanca is doing in the mountains to the actual work that's being done on the ground in these independent collectives and these groups throughout Puerto Rico. Also, what was with her children trying to inform the FBI of what she was doing? Like, why did both of her children want to turn her over to the FBI? Like, they both learned about the Young Lords movement growing up, about Puerto Rico's history, and so much of Puerto Rico's leftist movements have been disrupted by FBI and CIA. They've been infiltrated, people have been killed because of it. We have Olga at the very end when the revolution is happening. Her and Prieto are on the phone. One of them says, do we just let her do this? And then Olga goes on to say that she's so proud of her people, and the revolution is a force, it's an awakening, it's by and for the people. And then she's like, but I want to tell the FBI that my mother did all this. And she goes as far as to purchase a burner phone and call the FBI agent. And the only reason she decides not to tell the FBI that her mother was the one who orchestrated all of this is because she thinks when her mother is killed by the FBI, she'll be seen as a martyr, which will only further the independence movement. And then she just hangs up and she goes home. And that's how the book ends. I'm just like, what? How? What? Like, how can you say it's by and for the people and this is an awakening and then be like, I want my mom to be turned in? Because this is what, a crime? The independence of a nation who has never been free is a crime? I don't know. It just feels so weird for a character who's like super anti-colonialism to want to turn in her mother to the FBI.
Hi again. So I just wanted to say that watching this back, I'm thinking that it's possible they wanted to report their mother to the FBI because it would be a way of taking back power and control from her, from the way that she's treated them all of their lives. I can't really think of why else this would be a plot point, but I think that that's probably the reason.
So in that way, the book just felt imperialistic in its message. It almost makes the case against independence because it makes it seem like independence is extremist and wrong, and those who believe in it are brainwashed. That's kind of like the message I got from this book. I can totally see how people found the ending exciting and liberating. The ending shows that liberation is possible. So I get it from that sense. It also shows, Olga, Mateo, Prieto getting exactly what they wanted, as if like they've finally overcome all their obstacles and they can finally be happy. We have Olga and Mateo finding love. Olga is working on photography again, which is something that she's always loved. She vows to let go of her relationship with her mother and to move forward finally. And then Prieto is married and he's living the life that he deserved to live all along. So from that angle, I loved the ending. I just did not love the revolution. It wasn't for me. Last final thoughts. I wanted a better discussion on decolonization. I just think for a book that is so proudly anti-colonialism that it didn't really do a good job of discussing decolonization or actually being decolonial. However, I think if you don't know a lot about Puerto Rican history and politics, that this book is a great starting point. I'm so interested to see what other Puerto Ricans thought of this book, so please comment below. I want to chat. And if you're not Puerto Rican, I also want to hear from you. What did you like about this book? What didn't you like? I'm so excited to hear all of your thoughts. So if you made it to the end of this video, please leave a little hibiscus flower to let me know that you made it to the end. And I really appreciate you if you did, if you stayed this whole time. If you enjoyed this video and want to support my channel, please give this video a like, subscribe, turn on the notifications bell to see when I post more content. I post every Saturday morning. So again, I'm Heather. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next Saturday. Bye.